Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 113, After Vytautas. My apologies for the gap. I had a cold and couldn't record, so here's an extended episode to make up for it. And for members, your next episode will be coming out in a couple of days. Jogaila and Vytautas had been rivals and partners across decades of shaping what the union of Poland and Lithuania meant. As we heard last time, the idea of crowning Vytautas king of Lithuania was not about establishing an independent sovereign Lithuania, much as some nationalist historians would like it to be. It was about securing Lithuania's status in a union where there was disagreement over that status. It would not have been unusual for there to be two kings in a single state. Composite kingdoms and co-rulers were more normal than a single monarch across much of Europe. Rus is just one example, and Lithuania itself, with the Ruthenian Kняжество that it ruled, was similar. Since Jogaila took the crown of Poland, the Lithuanians had gradually become more and more used to closer cooperation with Poland, attending Polish assemblies, concluding new agreements to refine the framework of their cooperation, conducting diplomacy together, and making war together. Lithuania now had institutions that had not existed at the beginning of Vytautas' reign, and they would not be passive observers of what happened next. For Jogaila, securing the transfer of what the cousins had built to the next generation was a major dilemma. The Horodwar Agreement allowed the election of a new Grand Duke, but it did not require one. It stated that if the Lithuanians elected a new Grand Duke, they should consult first, but it did not say that there had to be a Grand Duke. The Lithuanian boyars had promised to elect a candidate nominated by Jogaila or the Polish Council, but there were two versions of the document. The Lithuanian version said that the Lithuanians could only choose the candidate the Poles sent them. The Polish document said that they had to choose a candidate in consultation with the Lithuanians. So, while the Horodwar Agreement led the Lithuanians to expect that they would elect Vytautas' successor, Jogaila had no actual obligation to allow the election. There was no obvious candidate with the same kind of stature as Vytautas, no one with whom he had the same kind of relationship, so he was in no hurry. Some Lithuanian historians argue that Vytautas intended his brother, Žygimantas, to become Grand Duke, but there's no evidence that Jogaila gave him any special consideration. Two of Jogaila's own brothers were still alive. Lengvenis would not be around for much longer and was likely disqualified by being Orthodox. Jogaila, however, was Catholic and only in his 50s. He had been left nothing by Algirdas and had lived a life of setbacks as he tried to seize what he thought he was owed. He was known for his hatred of Vytautas, acquired after being sent in chains to Krakow in 1393. Jogaila had given him Western Podolia in 1400, but he had lost it a couple of years later in the rebellions that followed the Vilnius-Radom Agreement. He was allowed back a couple of years later to serve in Vytautas' army against Smolensk, for which he was given some land on the Dnieper. This was not enough to satisfy him, and in 1408 he rebelled again and went over to the Tartars. Vytautas let him come back a year later, but kept him under house arrest in Vilnius, brought him to official dinners where he was made to sit at a low table and be mocked. He began conspiring with the order, which was discovered, leading him to flee again, and once more returned in order to serve in the army, this time being given Chernihiv, Bryansk, Trubchevsk, and Novgorod-Siversky. When Jogaila's son was born, Jogaila was the person most effective, and he appears to have decided that giving up rebelling and waiting for Vytautas to die was the best course. He supported Vytautas throughout the coronation affair, and as Vytautas was dying, he made sure that he was positioned to take the throne. You may have got rather a negative impression of Jogaila from the above tale, but historians have noted that everything we know about him comes from hostile Polish historians. At the same time, Jogaila consistently attracted loyal followers and was able to return to serve successfully in the military. So it seems that he was not quite the unstable, drunken rageaholic the Poles depict him as. We heard last time that Olesnicki, Długosz mentor, had been sent back to Poland to secure the council's agreement shortly before Vytautas' death. Długosz, who was not actually in a position to know this time, thinks that Jogaila sent him away on purpose to prevent him opposing Jogaila becoming the Grand Duke. But while Olesnicki was an influential leader, there was still a delegation of Polish nobles in Lithuania, ones better disposed to negotiations, who were not insisting on Lithuania's subordination. Olesnicki wrote to Jogaila anyway, demanding that he announce that Lithuania was now incorporated into Poland and Podolia returned to Polish rule. Jogaila was not interested in these moves, especially as making Lithuania into a province of Poland would undercut his battle to have his son's hereditary rights recognized. He was also reluctant to promote Jogaila. Vytautas had had no sons of his own, and Jogaila had trusted him to uphold his son's rights. Jogaila was still young enough to produce his own children. Jogaila played for time by announcing that the body would be carried from Trakai to Vilnius, and that then there would be a funeral lasting several days. Some sources suggest that he was inclined to take over the government of Lithuania himself. There is correspondence stating that he did not want Jogaila to succeed, and emphasizing that he saw himself as Lithuania's legitimate hereditary ruler. Jogaila's past rebellions and ingratitude were mentioned. This is where we can see that Jogaila might not have been entirely the good-for-nothing that Polish historians paint him, because while Jogaila tried to play for time and reassert his personal control over Lithuania, the Lithuanians lined up behind Jogaila. His men occupied the castles of Vilnius and Trakai. Then he called a gathering of the boyars where they elected him Grand Duke by a large majority, and then he had Jogaila placed under house arrest. Jogaila was not just the younger brother who thought he'd been passed over and suffered from resentment. It turned out that he had substantial support across the Lithuanian and Ruthenian elite. Jogaila should probably have known about this. When he declared his intention of ruling Lithuania again personally, an order intelligence report sent to Eric of Norway said that the Lithuanian and Ruthenian boyars had told them that they did not want him. He had moved to Poland and neglected them. Oleshnitsky, trying to force the issue of Lithuanian subordination while Vytautas was dying, had also stirred up significant anti-Polish feeling. Other contemporary sources agree that the Union was in crisis. Some of the reports that it was at risk of breaking up may be wishful thinking. The Order, in particular, had been dreaming of its collapsing ever since Tannenberg, but we have both Lithuanian and Polish reports that people were favouring separation. The Order approached Jogaila, but he was unwilling to commit to separation unless the Order was willing to commit to him. The last 20 years had demonstrated how much stronger Lithuania was together with Poland. Jogaila was, in any case, constrained by what his boyars thought. Resentment of Polish arrogance and demands for incorporation and support for Lithuanian autonomy was not necessarily the same as support for dissolution of the Union. While Jogaila had been detained, this was a question relating to the succession. He was not deposed, and no one said that he was not king. This, too, favoured the Union. When the Lithuanians said that they did not wish to be ruled by Jogaila, they were not saying that he could not go back to Poland and continue to be the hereditary overlord of their new Grand Duke. Some may simply not have wanted to replace one old man with another old man who was unlikely to last for long. At the end of the day, it was quite natural for the Lithuanians to want to be ruled by a Lithuanian who was living in Lithuania. Horodor had established a confused system of succession, and Jogaila had complicated it even more. The agreement had said that the Lithuanians could elect a Grand Duke, and they had done so. It did not say that they could do it without Jogaila nominating the candidate, but that cat was out of the bag, so little could be done there. It said the Poles should be consulted, but they hadn't been. The boyars' election completely rejected the position of Oleshnitsky and the other incorporationist Poles. On the other hand, if the Lithuanians continued to acknowledge Jogaila's supreme authority and the hereditary rights of his sons, he had not lost anything, and the union could be considered affirmed. Jogaila accepted that this was the situation. He quickly asserted his right to approve the election by sending Jogaila a ring as a symbol of his new authority. He agreed to keep the peace between Poland and Lithuania and called an assembly for the following year to discuss any disputes among them. It was not going to be that easy, though. On 6th of December, the Polish Council issued a condemnation of Jogaila's detention and declared Jogaila's election unlawful. The use of force to free Jogaila was discussed, but that was a step too far. Instead, an embassy led by Oleshnitsky was sent to conduct negotiations. In the end, it was unnecessary. Jogaila released Jogaila before it got to Lithuania. Meanwhile, Jogaila wrote to Sigismund of Luxembourg and Rusdorf of the Teutonic Order, proposing an alliance. Not against Poland, he also proposed including Jogaila and making himself an intermediary between Jogaila and Sigismund. He also asked Sigismund for the crown that he had promised, to Vytautas. Sigismund was not interested in negotiations with Jogaila, but he was ready to send the crown. On 19th of June 1431, Jogaila signed a defensive agreement with the order which guaranteed that it would provide support in the event of a conflict with Poland. Towards the end of the same year, he married Anna, daughter of Boris of Tver, who bore him a son at the end of 1432. The child did not live long, but for Jogaila, it was a shot across the bows. Jogaila was capable of establishing a separate line of succession that could compete with Jogaila's own sons. There was probably no special significance in him marrying an Orthodox Rus princess, but what was notable, especially to the Poles, was that he had relied on support from Orthodox Ruthenians to stage his coup. There was one area where it was absolutely clear that Jogaila had gone against the Horodwar Agreement, which had only given Catholic Lithuanians the rights enjoyed by their Polish Szlachta counterparts. Jogaila himself had been baptized Catholic, and without any chopping and changing like Vytautas. But, as we heard a few minutes ago, on those occasions when he had made up with Jogaila and Vytautas, he had been given lands in Ruthenian areas, where he had built relationships with the Ruthenian nobility and cultivated their support. If the union was for Catholics, this represented a risk. But if he were to break away into an independent Lithuania, it would still be a composite state with two rival religions, so its future would still be in serious question. As I've mentioned before, the standard explanation for why the Lithuanians chose Catholicism over Orthodoxy was to preserve their separate identity. So the entrenchment of a new Catholic elite with special privileges was also an attack on Lithuania's internal coherence. Lithuanians had been banned from marrying Ruthenians who did not convert to Catholicism, and Orthodox boyars had been explicitly excluded from the rights granted at Horodwar. The risk of Lithuanians losing their identity was raised by the numerical imbalance. There are various estimates of this. Serhii Plochy cites a 12-to-1 ratio for land settled by Ruthenians to land settled by Lithuanians, although this is difficult to reconcile with lands that were settled by both. Lithuania itself had a greater population density than Ruthenian lands, and Lithuanians had spread into Ruthenian territory. Other historians give estimates of Lithuanians making up between 10 and 20% of the population. There's no question that they were considerably outnumbered by Ruthenians. However, it was a completely different matter among the nobility. There, the split was closer to 50-50. There are problems with definitions here as well. Intermarriage was very common. Jogaila and Vytautas had Ruthenian mothers and spoke Ruthenian before they spoke Lithuanian, but they also both spoke in terms of we Lithuanians, you Ruthenians. Lithuania's political structure was very similar to that of Old Rus. Many of the Gediminids who had become knyazes as Lithuania expanded had converted to Orthodoxy and assimilated. In this sense, being part of Lithuania brought no change. The Grand Dukes often reiterated their promise that this would be the case. Starini nie ruszajem, a nowy nie wwodzim. We will not destroy the old, and we will not introduce the new. As we have discussed previously, Rus laws, customs, and political culture had had a big influence on the formation of Lithuania. even if we are rejecting nationalist narratives about the Grand Duchy being essentially Ukraine or Belarus in disguise. While the arguments about Ruthenian influence on Lithuania may be difficult to settle with the sources that we have, there is no doubt that when Jogaila made his decision to accept baptism and to marry Jadwiga for the throne of Poland, Lithuanian identity underwent a radical overhaul. The agreement at Horodor represented a decision that Lithuania proper would be treated differently from Samogitia and the Ruthenian territories. It created a two-tier system, right after Vytautas had already campaigned to rein in the Gediminids and increase centralization. In place of the previous tolerance, the Grand Duchy was becoming more authoritarian. This went quite deep. Only Catholics could be appointed as councillor to the Grand Duke. Only Catholics could hold office in Vilnius and Trakai, regions that had significant Orthodox populations. Jogaila had created the first private estates with gifts to the church. As Catholic councillors and officials were rewarded, private estates in Catholic hands also began to emerge. As these estates got bigger and their owners got more important, they became comparable to the old noble holdings. They had different legal rights, and this began to undermine the governing principles of the Grand Duchy, as Orthodox and Catholic lands were treated differently. Some of the lands granted to Catholic landholders were settled by Orthodox populations, and this led to further complications. This was not the result of any particular plan. As we've heard, Jogaila and Vytautas were making things up as they went along, aiming primarily at securing their own interests. They were not implementing some grand vision of a centralized state. Jogaila and Vytautas had tried to address the problem by creating a union of the Catholic and Orthodox Church in their territories. As we've already heard, that attempt failed, and the Metropolitan in Moscow remained the spiritual leader of Lithuania's Orthodox subjects. We don't know what those subjects thought about those efforts. The Ruthenian chronicles are not much help, as they were written by churchmen under Moscow's influence. We should be cautious about projecting later national identities back into the past, though. But if Catholic Lithuania were to break with Poland, it would need to solve its Ruthenian question. Maintaining special privileges as an elite over all the others could lead to Ruthenians looking at whether the grass was greener with their neighbours. We have no evidence that Jogaila and his supporters considered any of these questions before they allowed their dispute with Poland to become a war in 1429. The war was not over the big questions of the Union. It was a specific conflict over Volhynia and Podolia, territory the Lithuanians and Poles had been arguing about for nearly a century. Red Ruthenia, Orthodox lands. Jogaila had attempted to resolve the conflict by splitting the region in 1395 and giving the east to Vytautas and the west to a Polish ally, Spitek of Melsztyn. After Spitek died, he purchased the land from his widow and then sold it to Vytautas for his lifetime. Although Vytautas had installed a Lithuanian administration, Polish nobles gradually settled in Red Ruthenia, and here too the disparity in rights with Ruthenians began to become an issue. The Poles were paid to fight for Jogaila, the Ruthenians were not. The tax burden was unequal, as were their rights to move. All this led to increasing pressure from Ruthenians in Poland. In 1426, Sigismund asked Jogaila for aid against the Ottomans, and Jogaila summoned the boyars of Red Ruthenia to fight. Around 5,000 turned up and spent 2 months waiting for Sigismund on the Danube. Sigismund never came. Most of the boyars stayed at home, demanding that they be paid to fight like the Poles, or they would not go. Jogaila rounded up the ringleaders of the protest and seized their estates, but this harsh reaction only provoked more support for their demands. The Poles were aware of the issue and had drafted resolutions extending their privileges to the Ruthenians of Podolia and Volhynia, but these moves had not been carried through into practice. However, they did help to create favourable relations between the Poles and Ruthenians. When Vytautas died, the Bishop of Kamenets led local nobles in seizing several castles and declaring their loyalty to Poland. This was while Jogaila was under house arrest in Vilnius. Jogaila was outraged and made Jogaila confirm his position in Podolia. The Polish assembly publicly acquiesced, but sent secret instructions that Jogaila's orders should be ignored. Sporadic raiding broke out across the border with Lithuania. In February 1431, the Assembly of Sandy-Omerge sent an embassy to Jogaila, demanding that he apologize and hand Volhynia and Podolia over to Poland. The Lithuanians took this as a declaration of war. Polish and Lithuanian delegations met at Biecz in April with the Order as mediator, where the Lithuanians rejected the Polish demands and ordered them to hand the fortresses they were holding in Podolia back. The Poles assembled their army and attacked Borodwo. Although this conflict had been brewing for a while, we should note that it moved into military action because the parties had reached an impasse. Neither side particularly wanted to fight, and the conflict never reached a high intensity. Jogaila seized Lutsk, but was unable to take the castle. By August, they'd already agreed a truce. This truce is the subject of much debate. Jogaila had relied on his alliance with the Order, and they had answered his call. 3 days before the truce, they had attacked Poland. This attack would have split the Polish forces to Jogaila's advantage, but instead the truce allowed the whole Polish army to turn north and crush the Order. Some scholars have speculated that Jogaila did not receive the letter from the Order telling him that they had crossed the border. Others think that is unlikely, given that the invasion had been discussed for months. Still others, like Hrushevsky, argue that Jogaila was simply an incompetent moron. The most likely explanation is that the Lithuanians and Poles just didn't want to be fighting each other. While they were unable to reach an agreement over Podolia, the Poles had, since Jogaila took over, been making concessions aimed at preserving the Union and restoring good relations. In May 1432, the Poles formally recognized Jogaila as Grand Duke of Lithuania, on the same basis as Vytautas. It would have been better for Jogaila if he had been equally conciliatory. By this time, the extent of Jogaila's reliance on Ruthenian support was becoming obvious, and his Lithuanian support was starting to drift away. We can see the process in the documents that he signed. His first agreement with the Order was witnessed by 8 Lithuanian dukes and 1 Ruthenian boyar. The second one had 13 Ruthenians to 3 Lithuanians. He did not go out of his way to breach the Horodwar agreement, but he did appoint 2 Orthodox officials to posts that were supposedly reserved for Catholics, only in Vitebsk and Lutsk, which were Ruthenian territory. Notably, in stark contrast to Vytautas, he made no donations to the church. Anti-Polish feelings among the Lithuanian nobility had subsided as Ruthenian influence grew, assisted by Poland's restrained and constructive approach to settling the succession. So, when the offer to formally recognize Jogaila as Grand Duke on the same basis as Vytautas, without any demands for incorporation, arrived and was rejected in favor of a return to war, a Lithuanian opposition immediately sprang up in response. There's been some argument among historians about whether the plot against Jogaila originated from the Poles or they merely provided support. It's more likely the latter. The plot was led by Simeon Holshansky, Sonka's uncle. Several prominent Ruthenians were involved, once again showing that these events were still due more to personal interests than anachronistic ideas of national identity or patriotism. The fact that it was Catholic-led and Catholicism in Lithuania still rested on Polish foundations also speaks against the idea that the plotters were Lithuanian separatists. On 1st September 1432, Jogaila was on his way to Brest to meet with Jogaila. The plotters arrested his wife and some of his councillors. Jogaila himself escaped with some of his supporters, possibly warned by an insider. Plotters, with their Polish supporters, immediately declared Vytautas' brother, Žygimantas, the new Grand Duke. Žygimantas swiftly secured control over Lithuania proper, while Palatsk, Vitebsk, Smolensk, and Kyiv remained in Jogaila's hands. The resulting civil war is often portrayed as Lithuanians against Ruthenians, especially by Hrushevsky and his followers. It was not really as clear-cut as that, though. Jogaila had Lithuanian supporters and Žygimantas had Ruthenians. Žygimantas supporters were essentially Vytautas men. They had worked closely with Ruthenians before, and now they offered concessions to win them back to their side. Envoys were sent to Jogaila for his approval of the new Grand Duke, and Olesnicki led a Polish embassy to Vilnius. After a week of negotiations, they reached an agreement that's usually called the Union of Grodno. But it was more of a document governing how Žygimantas was going to rule Lithuania. The agreement was apparently reached quite easily, with Olesnicki abandoning his incorporationist rhetoric in favor of a more pragmatic approach, and turned the clock more or less back to the situation we had at the beginning of the century. There was lots of talk about peaceful alliance and brotherhood, resulting in an outcome acceptable to both Lithuanians and Poles. Žygimantas was recognized as the Grand Duke in the same way as Vytautas, as holding his position from Jogaila, with the approval of the nobility, appointed for life but ultimately subordinate to Jogaila. Vilnius and other territories designated as Jogaila's patrimony were granted by him as Supreme Duke of Lithuania, not King of Poland. Upon Žygimantas' death, they would revert to Jogaila or his heirs. Trakai was confirmed as Žygimantas' patrimony, although his heirs would remain subordinate to the heirs of Jogaila. The Hrodna Agreement also set out that the Grand Duke would not seek a royal crown or accept one from any other power, such as the Holy Roman Empire or the Pope, without the consent of Jogaila, his successors, and the Polish crown. The issue of Podolia and Volhynia was fudged. Podolia returned to Polish control. Volhynia went to the Lithuanians for the lifetime of Žygimantas. The agreement has been criticized as weak, but it showed both sides stepping back from the drama of Vytautas and his coronation, and should be taken as indicating that both wanted to continue the union. The surrounding circumstances were still highly uncertain. Jogaila was around 80 by now, and his health was deteriorating. An advisor wrote to Jogaila in 1431 describing the king as more dead than alive. Jogaila himself still controlled most of the Ruthenian lands. He was still in alliance with the Order and supported by Livonian troops. But it quickly became apparent that they were no match for Poland and Lithuania. After defeats in 1432 and 1433, Jogaila tried to open negotiations without success. When Jogaila died in 1434, a number of Ruthenian nobles took the opportunity to switch sides. In 1435, the Prussians also joined Jogaila, bringing his army to 11,000, although besides the Teutonic contingent they were mostly light cavalry. The Polish council called up the noble levy and supplied nearly 5,000 men to Žygimantas. The two armies met on the Sventoyi River. And Svitogaila's forces were destroyed. Many were forced into the river and drowned. The Order withdrew and signed a peace treaty. Svitogaila accepted his loss and went into exile in Wallachia. The succession and civil war had made it plain that excluding the Orthodox subjects of Lithuania was a threat to the Polish-Lithuanian Union. In 1430, the Poles had granted noble privileges to the Orthodox of Red Ruthenia. In 1432, Žygimantas, with the support of Olesnicki, moved to grant the Orthodox of Lithuania the same privileges as their Lithuanian. Not all the questions were resolved. The wording of the document stated that privileges were granted to the Ruthenian knyazes, boyars, nobles, and inhabitants subject to Lithuania, which could be interpreted as only applying to Lithuania proper. The status of orthodoxy itself was not addressed. However, a commitment was made that Orthodox believers of any sex or status would not be forcibly converted. In 1434, Žygimantas issued a general privilege to the Ruthenians of Lithuania. This time, the document stated that it applied to the Lithuanian and Ruthenian lands. It did not explicitly mention orthodoxy or even Orthodox believers, but it did clearly state that it applied to Lithuanians and Ruthenians equally, which allowed it to be interpreted to the same effect. Ruthenian boyars now acquired the same rights with respect to taxation and their estates. The equality was not quite total. The requirement for high officials to be Catholic was still in place. Polish Ruthenians were able to participate in the running of local courts, but this right did not extend to Lithuania. However, it was by any measure a significant change, one that some Polish historians argue could not have happened in any other Catholic country at the time, and which showed an intrinsic commitment to freedom. This may be a bit of an exaggeration, There was also no other Catholic country that had a majority Orthodox population, so it's hard to compare. There was quite strong opposition to the concessions in Poland. Długosz, for instance, thought that they were shameful and that Lithuanian Ruthenians had been handed privileges that they did not deserve, that Poles had fought for decades to achieve. But what it did show was that Poland and Lithuania could move beyond the personal relationship of Jogaila and Vytautas and their dynastic interests. In both Lithuania and Poland, there were people who valued the union and wished to preserve it, and they were willing to be pragmatic and take practical steps to preserve it, without insisting on any ideological position. Thank you for listening, and until next time.